Hello, everyone. So we have a small group today, which is perfect because it means that I get to have a slightly more intimate session with you where we'll get to answer some more individualized questions. So I'm going to go through the PowerPoint fairly quickly. We weren't sure what size group we'd have today. It is, I know, a rather miserable day for those of you who were watching the news. I know you probably are in a rather somber mood given the Parkland verdicts, and I feel that somber mood as well. But hopefully we can find, some hope in talking about careers and talking about, possibilities, because there are loads of possibilities career-wise. Now, one thing that I'm always happy to share is that psychology as a field is thriving. So, psychologist was ranked number 2 on the U.S. News and World Report best job in science list, which is a wonderful thing because it is a really good job. And number 3 on the best jobs in science list is industrial psychologist, and number 9 is survey researcher. So why are these things notable? They're notable because these are all things that we train you for here at CUNY SPS. So we have an IO master's program, and in IO a master's is considered the level where you are a professional. So you can be an IO practitioner with a master's in IO, and there's so many options for IO. As we've all seen, we are in a phase of transition in terms of how we think about employment, how we think about of modes of employment, remote work, etc. And so it's wonderful to see IO ranked so highly when IO professionals really deserve a lot of credit for all of the hard work that they've done to, help us get through these transitions. Okay. So psychology is thriving, and one of the reasons why it's thriving is because it provides you with this fantastic skill set. So by majoring in psychology, or minoring in psychology, which is the case for some of you, you have the possibility of acquiring a lot of different types of skills. So you're learning to think analytically. So you're actually learning to analyze situations and to draw conclusions based on evidence. You're learning to think critically. So critical thinking and analytic thinking are close friends, but they're not exactly the same. Critical thinking has to do with not necessarily accepting everything around you and asking questions and seeking to compare and contrast. Analytical thinking can be compare and contrast, but it also can be relative to looking at the data and drawing conclusions from the data and from the evidence. So they're, as I said, close friends, but not exactly the same. You learn information acquisition and management in psychology, so research, so how to get the information and then how to manage the information. And then you learn data analysis skills, so how to analyze the data, problem solving, leadership and organization, collaborative skills, where psychologists, you may notice, are always working with someone else, where it's very rare that you have, for example, a published paper in psychology written by one person. I typically write with 2 other people, and I don't talk to them every day, but there are days when I talk to them 5, 6, 7 times a day. And I've gone through phases where I've talked to them every day because we're working together. Being a researcher can be a little lonely, but being a researcher who collaborates can be a lot of fun and allows for greater creativity. So these are all skills that you can acquire by majoring or minoring in psychology. And as you can probably deduce, these are skills that are transferable to a wide variety of areas. So again, the reason why psychology is thriving, psychology is one of the most popular, majors. I think it's about 12% of people in college major in psychology, is because the skills that you acquire through a psychology major are transferable. So not everyone who majors in psychology goes on to necessarily become a psychologist or do something that is psychology specific, but they use the skills they acquired through psychology major to do a wide variety of things. So what can you do with a BA in psychology? With a BA in psychology, you develop skills for customer service. You probably have a better understanding of the importance of being patient than a lot of people. Public relations. I have a very close friend who majored in psychology as an undergrad and who works for one of the top crisis management firms in the country. And this was just a bachelor's degree, and it took her far less time, than me to reach, whatever salary goal she had in mind. Marketing, that's another area. There is a marketing psychology submajor, or you can do marketing psychology certificate. They have lots of courses at CUNY for that. So we have a few offerings here at SPS. But if you go to City College, for example, they have a whole, marketing psychology subdivision. And there is a possibility of taking courses at other CUNY schools, even though you're at SPS. You could be a patient advocate / patient coordinator. So psychologists are increasingly in primary care settings, and that means that psychology majors are going to be there to assist them and work with them. Because, if you have a BA in psychology, you know the basics in terms of research, theory, a wide variety of different things that can help you in assisting within certain settings and understanding the needs of a patient. And that's a job that's also gaining popularity with a master's degree. You can work as a research assistant. Hospitals hire research assistants. Research organizations hire research assistants. You could be a research coordinator. You move up. You start off as an assistant and then you move up to coordinator. So the reason why everyone in psych takes methods is so that you have the possibility of getting a job, and research assistant is one of those jobs. Case manager. That's another possibility with a bachelor's degree in psychology. And there are a lot of others. Psychology majors go into writing quite a bit. They go into a lot of leadership style positions, working in not-for-profits. I didn't write everything here, but I welcome your questions, and also we can have a further conversation down the line. So now, what can you do with an MA? With an MA, you can do a lot of different things. There are data scientists. That's a very, very hot field right now. So just analyzing data, who have their degrees in psychology. You can get your training in psychology with a focus on data analysis. So that's taking more stats classes, not fewer stats classes. I know sometimes students say, I'm just going to take what's required. No, take a little bit more, see what's out there. We have a lot of opportunities at SPS, and there are opportunities outside of SPS as well. You can work as a survey researcher with a master's. You can do survey administration with a bachelor's, and that's part of the research assistant position. Patient / community advocates, again, people with degrees in psychology are increasingly in demand in primary care. And so clinics, doctors' offices are all hiring people who have knowledge of human behavior and an understanding of human thinking patterns to work in their offices. HR professionals. So you can be an HR professional with a master's in IO. You can also be an HR professional with a certificate and a bachelor's, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Research coordinators. So often the coordinator of the entire research team will be someone who has a master's in psychology. Sometimes it's someone who is a doctoral student at the same time, but quite often it's just someone who has a master's in psychology. I also worked as a research coordinator when I just had a bachelor's, but that was because I moved up. I was promoted from assistant to coordinator, and again, but with a master's, you're considered to have greater mastery over the field. And depending on what you get your master's in, you can be a therapist as well with a master's degree. So a master's in counseling, so mental health counseling master's, for example, that's a good way to become a therapist if that's what you're interested in. And we'll talk about some other degrees. So now the question often is, do you need a doctorate in psychology? And my answer to you is, it depends on what you want to do. So if you want to be considered a psychologist, meaning if you want to walk the streets and scream, I'm a psychologist, hey, or however it is that you would present yourself, you have to have a doctorate. Often, depending on the state you live in, you're not considered a psychologist unless you have a PhD and you have a license. You can't open a business saying, I'm a psychologist, unless you have a PhD and a license. Okay, to be considered an expert, often people expect you to have a PhD. So, what does it mean to be considered an expert? It means to be considered the person who will supervise the entire team. And the one who's going to lead the team would be the one who is considered to have greater seniority or expertise. And that's often going to be the person who has the doctorate. If you want a career in academia, a PhD is pretty handy. There's Judith Rich Harris, who has just a master's degree. Eric Erikson, one of our famous theorists, did not have a PhD. So there's a lot of people who don't have them and who manage to forge a career in academia, but it's a little harder than if you actually have the doctorate. Now let's talk about something more exciting, which is what to do, why you don't need a PhD. So obviously, I'm a little biased towards the PhD, but I perfectly understand that not everyone wants to spend 15 years in school, that maybe you want to do something different with your life, do something a little bit more exciting and not be a broke student forever. Okay, so what can you do with your PhD? So without a PhD, you can be a therapist. So there are MA programs that train you to be a therapist. A lot of students say, "Oh, I really want to do therapy." And yes, you have that possibility with a master's in counseling. You have that possibility with an MSW. You have that possibility with a wide variety of different avenues. There, you have to do a little research, look to see what's out there, but you can find the avenue, and master's in counseling programs are available at several CUNY colleges. Now, there are also various types of research and data science positions that you can have without having a doctorate. So if you're someone who just wants to analyze data and you are interested in working for an organization such as, so like Nickelodeon, hires data scientists. Girl Scouts of America hires data scientists. There's a wide variety of organizations that people don't really think of that just hire people to analyze data for them or hire people who have expertise in a particular area. I have a friend who has a master's in developmental psychology who works for a toy company. She spends her days playing with toys and answering parents' questions about the toys and how their children play with the toys. And then she trains people who work for the company in how to answer these questions. And it's basically, she's a toy specialist. It's not a job that a lot of us have, but it's a job that many of us, find very interesting and intriguing. And this is what my friend does professionally with a master's in developmental psychology. You can teach introductory courses with just a master's. You can also teach high school psychology courses. Psychology at the high school level is gaining popularity, and the American Psychological Association has some collaborations with high schools. Now, if you really are interested in a doctorate, we'll learn more about that later today. I'll tell you about that session in a moment. But let me tell you about different types of doctorates. So there's a PhD, that's a doctor of philosophy. There's a PsyD, that's a doctor of psychology. And there's an EdD, that's a doctor of education. The PhD is always heavy on research with depending on the program, some clinical application. It's a research degree, really. The PsyD is a clinical degree. There's a minor focus on research. Depending on which program you're in, there might be a larger focus on research. But the PsyD is primarily for people who want to be clinicians. The PhD will primarily be for those who want to be researchers, and it's also for those who want to be clinicians. It's the older degree among those. The EdD is more of a research and education degree. The EdD is the degree that is often given in more applied programs. So that's, for example, the degree they give if you go to Teachers College at Columbia. Now, admission to PhD programs is very competitive. Admission rates vary from 7%, range from 7% to 15% in most doctoral programs. So that means if 100 people apply, only 7 might get in to a clinical people. So 7 out of 100 people will get into a clinical program. The most competitive programs tend to be clinical psych and developmental psych. Developmental psych is very heavy on data analysis at this point and on the biological sciences at this point. Clinical psychology also is very heavily into biological sciences in terms of there's a big influence of neuropsychology in general at the doctoral level. So we see that influence, and that influence has led to even lower rates of admission. The highest rates of admission tend to be in applied programs. So school psychology PhD programs have about a 28% admission rate. Now, once you're admitted, doctoral programs are not easy to complete, so that's why completion rates are at about 50%. So 50% of people who attend a doctoral program will actually get their degree. Now, the average time for completion is 5 to 7 years. Some people take a little longer, some people take a little bit less time. Doctoral programs in psychology tend to be fully or partially funded. What does funding mean? Funding means that you're going to get a tuition waiver, and then you will get some sort of stipend. So for example, I went straight from my getting my bachelor's degree. I took a couple of years off, worked in New York City public schools, and then I went to a PhD program. My graduate education was fully funded in that I had a tuition waiver, and then I had 2 year fellowship. Plus, I also had an assistantship where I taught, and I received a salary for teaching. And I taught as a teaching assistant, not teaching my own courses when I taught. As part of my funding. And because there's such a demand at the undergraduate level, so I mentioned to you earlier that 12% of undergrads major in psychology, that's how psychology doctoral programs can be funded. And so they'll admit maybe 5 students a year to a program, 6 students a year to a program. The largest class I've ever seen was 13 students. And then those students will all have a tuition waiver and a stipend. You're not going to be rich. You may not even be comfortable, especially if you live in New York City, but you can survive. And at least you're not taking on debt, which is what people in most doctoral programs end up having to do. So psychology does a little something in terms of at least providing a tuition waiver, and that's a good thing. So other degrees to consider. So I mentioned a master's in counseling. That is a really good degree. There are lots of programs around New York City. There are programs at Brooklyn College. There are programs at Hunter. So, obviously I'm promoting CUNY because, we keep it in the family in terms of that type of promotion, but there are other programs at other schools. They're a little more expensive, but they are available. They're out there. You could also consider getting an MSW, that's a Master's of Social Work. So a Master's of Social Work is a little bit more involved as a degree. It's not just straightforward counseling. You have different tracks within social work programs. There are community tracks, and then there are clinical tracks in social work programs. And you have the possibility of learning a wide variety of things about working with people in context. And, social work has changed a lot over the last couple of decades, but it is, again, like psychology, thriving. And social workers are moving into different areas of work. They're moving into primary care. There are proposals. So as you may know, in New York State, it's mandatory for there to be a social worker in every school, at least one social worker. And what they're proposing now is to have it be mandatory for there to be a social worker in every police precinct and in other settings where social workers can offer, better communication between the professionals and the communities they're supposed to serve. There are other degrees to consider, such as certificates and, other types of credentials. So if you decide that that you want to stop at the bachelor's degree, that you don't necessarily think you need to go to graduate school, that's a good choice for those who want to be credentialed alcoholism and substance abuse counselors, so CASAC. You don't have to have a master's for that. You don't have to have a PhD. You can get this type of credential and you can help the people you want to help. You can serve the type of population that you may want to serve. Also, you can get a human resources credential. So there are different human resources certificates. There's a professional in human resource that's offered at a couple of CUNY colleges. There's the SHRM also that's offered at a couple of community colleges. And I highly recommend looking into those if you're someone who knows you don't want to spend 5,000 years in school. For more information just in general about doctoral programs, graduate schools, consider attending the series that starts tonight, Preparing for Grad School. It's at 6 p.m. and events sent out emails. The psychology program also sent out emails, and you can find this information about that event on the site for events, the CUNY SPS website on the events landing page. And finally, this is in the chat as well. So I have career advisement hours every other Friday that I wear from 1 to 2. I provide career advisement, and I'm happy to answer individual questions. And since we've got time, let's get to questions now. I see there are a few things in the chat that you can place your questions in the chat. Oh, I see a couple of questions. How different are MSW and clinical psychology PhD programs in terms of career opportunities or outcomes? Something to keep in mind is that these are different fields with different goals. I will start off by talking more generally, and then I can give you some concrete examples. So in terms of, so an MSW, a Master's in Social Work, if you go on the clinical track, you will be working still as a therapist who interacts with social systems in terms of you receive the same training as other MSWs in terms of how to navigate different opportunities that are available as far as community resources go. Because remember, a social worker, the job is not just to flat out do therapy, it's to be a liaison between the larger community, the larger governmental systems, and the person who is there. And so your training is a little bit more elaborate than that in, for example, a master's in counseling program, where you actually are learning, the history of different benefits programs, and you are learning in a way that allows you to make recommendations. So it's specifically oriented towards making recommendations where you engage with your environment, and it is a systems-based degree where you work with family systems, government systems, not just with the individual in isolation, which is what counseling tends to be more focused on. A clinical psychology PhD is a research degree first and foremost. That's something to keep in mind. So with an MSW, you have the possibility of working in a school, working in a hospital, working in a clinic, and of doing a wide variety of different things that are opportunities for social workers. Social work salaries are going up, they are improving, and something to keep in mind is that social workers are very much in demand, just as psychologists are very much in demand. Now, clinical psychology, again, this is the hardest PhD program to get into. Developmental, the rates are low. Admission for developmental, the rates are lower, but that's another conversation that we could have later on. But in clinical psychology, you have the possibility of pursuing an academic career. You also have the possibility of pursuing a career as, a psychologist in private practice. Something to always keep in mind for both of these, if your goal is private practice as opposed to working for an institution such as a hospital, you'll have to keep in mind that you have to rent space, you have to have insurance, you have to bill a client list. So there are advantages to thinking of working for an organization. And as I mentioned, hospitals, schools, all hire MSWs. Clinical psychologists also will work in hospitals. They will have academic careers. So there are different opportunities. They're very, very different fields. An MSW is certainly not the equivalent. There's a DSW, that's a doctorate in social work, and that would be more parallel to a clinical degree. So let's see, other questions. All right, so what opportunities are there for students to apply to be research assistants? I'm paraphrasing a little bit your questions. In schools, with school teachers, what types of internships would allow for all of that? Okay, so let's talk about research assistantships. So what you should be on the lookout for if you're interested in gaining research experience is emails that we send out or posts that we put on LinkedIn, that the psychology programs puts on LinkedIn, advertising for someone who is looking for a research assistant. Last year, I was able to place several students in research assistant positions. That was 2021. I didn't do as much this year, but I think last year there were 5 different students whom I found opportunities for, but I probably will have something else before the end of the year. Also, look to see who's doing research and approach those people. At CUNY SPS, you can, go to your professor's office hours, talk to them, see if they're working on anything. Um, there are people advertising on different job boards for research assistants. You can also get a volunteer job at a hospital where you volunteer as a research assistant. I've mentioned this before. My volunteering as a research assistant, my first experience as a research assistant was at Mount Sinai, and that was in clinical neurophysiology, where I was working in with a neurologist, and basically wherever he went, I went. And I did intake for his research participants. I did a wide variety of different things, Spanish English translation. There's a lot that you can do as a research assistant that provides you with the experience. Which psychology path would maximize chances of getting a job out there? Also, private practice I can get with a master's, you said. Okay, so so private practice requires insurance and requires you to rent space so that you can actually have clients. So that can be a bit tricky because you want to build a client base first. And so I would caution with against private practice, but there are lots of agencies, lots of organizations that are out there and that offer the possibility of getting a job, working with clients, and doing the type of work that you want to do. Let me go to the next part of the question. There are other questions as well. So maximizing your chances of getting a job. Psychology is hot right now. For those of you who came in a little bit late, the number two best job in science, according to US News and World Report, is being a psychologist. Number three is being an industrial organizational psychologist. Being a data scientist or survey researcher is going to be number nine. So psychology is thriving in terms of jobs, and really think about what you want to do, what makes sense to you. There are some people for whom industrial organizational psychology or going into HR makes a lot of sense, but there are other people for whom it does not make sense. I'm going to scroll through additional questions in our final 2 minutes. Okay, so becoming a physician's assistant. So physician's assistant programs are different. You can do a master's as a physician's assistant after completing your bachelor's degree. And it's a slightly different program than a psychology program. Let's see, what happens if you have a felony in terms of license? So it depends on the state. Depending on what state you're in, some states allow you to get a license, other states do not allow you to get a license. Do your research and advocate for yourself. Okay. Can I use a BA or MA in forensic psychology for law enforcement? Absolutely. Excuse me. All right, so yeah, so you can absolutely work. There are a lot of people who are so NYPD officers, for example, who went to John Jay and who got their degree in forensic psychology and are doing really, really well. And as you know, there is funding. How difficult is it to get into a developmental psychology program? So do you mean a master's program or a PhD program? Master's programs, it's 60% admission rate for masters in psychology, 50 to 60% admission rate. PhD programs in psychology, for developmental psychology, the admission rate is for doctoral programs is about 7 to 8%. But something to keep in mind is that you want to not say to yourself it's impossible unless your grades really aren't where they need to be. I can talk to you more specifically about your situation if for those of you who are interested. There are one-on-one sessions tomorrow, and you can simply get the link by clicking on the form, fill out the form, and get the link and stop by. But something to always keep in mind is that even though the numbers aren't ideal, it doesn't mean that you have no chance of getting in. You have to believe in yourself. You also have to be realistic. So, talk to different people, ask questions, and keep in mind that having a 4.0 doesn't guarantee admission, just as having a 3.5 3.5 or 3.3 won't guarantee that you're not going to be admitted to a PhD program. Programs look for a lot of different things, including fit, and I highly recommend attending tonight's Preparing for Graduate School session to hear a little bit more about that. So thank you everyone for your questions. Please stop by the one-on-one sessions tomorrow for more. Come by the Preparing for Graduate School series. It starts tonight. And thank you to the tech team again. Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Raul, for everything that you do. And I look forward to seeing you next semester for more Lunch and Learns.